I'm Keenan Bishop. I'll be moderating today. I handed out the survey cards. I know I've missed a few, so before you leave, make sure you've got one of these, and please leave it for some feedback for us. Our speakers today, I will introduce the two of them. Mr. Dave Burge has raised registered Angus cattle in Anderson County since 2000. He realized early on that high-quality pastures and soil health were important to his farming operation. He started a rotational grazing program, implemented multiple conservation initiatives, experimented with various grasses, and in 2018 became committed to bale grazing as a method to boost fertility. Dave lives in Lawrenceburg with his wife Susan at Justamere Angus. And since I know both of these gentlemen personally, I get to interject a little personal note. And Dave's been hiking the Appalachian Trail. I don't think he's quite done the whole thing yet, but still got some time. Our other speaker is Dr. Greg Halich, an ag economist at UK, where he works with farmers to improve profitability on livestock and grain farms. His current livestock focus areas include biological farming techniques that reduce or eliminate the need for commercial fertilizer inputs, grass-finished beef production, bale grazing, and extended season grazing systems. He lives and farms in southern Whitford County outside of Lexington, where he produces grass-finished beef. And an interesting tidbit about Greg is he's of Ukrainian descent and shared a borscht recipe with me a couple weeks ago that was excellent. I'll turn it over to you guys.
You don't have a hand held like that, or we need to probably stand here. They're getting it. So just very quickly, Dave is actually going to start out, but we are not going to do a traditional presentation where I do half or he does half. So we're just going to kind of go back and forth. We're going to keep this very informal and flexible. So if you have questions as we're going along, I think we've built in enough time where we should be okay in time and get through everything. Is this okay? All right. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave to start out, and be careful of that.
Okay, thanks for coming. A lot of good things going on. I actually wish I could hear the mushroom one. But thanks for coming to this one. I am Dave Burge. Somewhere around 26 to 35 head of registered Angus cattle in southern Anderson County. And I started out, I was interested in genetics, and I thought that was going to be my thing. And once I got raising the cattle, I found out how important the forages are. And then from that, I got just very interested in plant diversity and then soil health. And I don't claim to be an expert on the microbes and the funguses and everything that live in the soil, but I do realize how important it is. So that's kind of what has driven me and gotten me to this point. Thanks a lot to Dr. Halich. I haven't used fertilizer on my farm on the pasture. I've got 110 acres, 16 rotational grazing paddocks. Most of my hay, sometimes I mow hay for grass control, but a lot of my hay I make off the farm and bring it back on the farm. So that's kind of where I'm at. So the first part, grazing management is very important to soil health. And I think in my mind, a lot of this, I've done this for so long, a lot of this seems very simple, but it has a major impact, and it is pretty important. So yeah, that's what I wanted to see. So kind of my take on this slide is there's nothing new under the sun. So back in 1959, this gentleman, made this law about grazing, and it's the period of occupation for a paddock should not allow grass to be sheared more than once. And you know, there's a lot of rules that we talk about, or guidelines for grazing and grazing management, but whether you subscribe to take half, leave half, or just take one pass, whatever you do, the point here is, and that's, we're going to make this point repeatedly, is don't take it all the way down. Leave something there. I like to think about the blade as the photosynthesis engine that keeps everything going. So we'll talk for a second here about chronic back grazing, and I'm going to describe two different scenarios. So let's say one is you've got a water source and you're going to be doing you know, rotational grazing or some kind of controlled grazing, and you've got a water source and you start moving your fences away from that water source. Let's just say you make your first move and it's 4 days. You make another move, they've got fresh grass, they go to that. Maybe you're at 8 days or something, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Once you start getting beyond that point, there's going to be some new grass come up in that first section. And the whole point is you've got to keep giving them fresh grass and enticing them to stay away from that. So if you don't, you get the chronic back grazing, which actually makes you approach like conventional grazing, and you don't get all the benefits of the rotational grazing. And what I do to avoid that is I've got, like I said, on my 110 acres, I've got 16 paddocks, and I graze them on one paddock, and then I don't have to worry about back grazing, because when they're done with that, when they make that first pass, I move them to the next paddock. They can't get back. Now, I have to have a little more infrastructure. I've got a water system or a water tank between two paddocks. So there's a fence that goes over the paddock. I don't have to worry about back grazing. So when we talk about good grazing management, in my mind, we're talking about managing the stocking rate and the pasture growth and keeping in mind the soil fertility, and everything else has to revolve around that. So how do you do that? You have to manage the residual. In other words, and I'm saying it again, you don't want to graze it too short. You want to leave some blade there or leaf or whatever, for whatever kind of grass you're growing. Leave some residual so it can rebound, and then limit your back grazing, or limit it or eliminate it, however you decide to do that. And then the last thing is plenty of rest. Now, your rest is going to be determined by what you've got in your forage system, you know, grass, forbs, legumes, whatever it is, and how good your soil is and how far you've come on building your soil. But you know, like when on my farm, I built the rotation, the 16 paddocks, was all designed to give 30 days of rest. And I kind of got lucky because at the time I didn't know enough to know that if my soils were poor enough, that might needed to have been 45 days or 60 days if it was really bad. So that's one thing you've got to learn, but I think if you start with 30 days rest, you'll probably be in the ballpark. So, you know, I'm mentioning 16 paddocks and waters all over the farm and all that kind of stuff. The key here is that if you just get started, you're going to make a heck of an improvement. So this guy, back in the 60s, said that the largest increase in grazing efficiency, and so who thinks, I mean, do you think you got to be at 1 day rotation? moving your cattle every day, is that the most efficient? Anybody want to take a guess? So this guy says that going from a continuous grazing situation where you've got all your cows, access to all the grass all the time, if you move to just 3 paddocks, you've made the largest improvement, and you can get small increases after that, but if you just go to 3, so let's just say you've got your farm and maybe you've got a pond in the middle or something, or 1 water tank. If you could split that into 3, maybe 4, 4 is where I started. In 2014, when I started rotational grazing, I had a creek that ran through the middle of the farm, and I basically cut the farm in half along the creek, and all of a sudden, boom, 4 paddocks, and there you go. That was my start. I had portable mineral feeders, and then from that, I went to portable water systems, and it's a little more difficult, but I got more paddocks, and then, it just goes from there. But I just want everybody to know that there's your biggest bang for the buck, is just getting started on rotational grazing. And that's, like I said, that's from back in the 60s. So, here we go. All I had to do was see this slide, and it reminded me of 2014 when I started, and I thought I was doing good, and I was working. I kind of had an older gentleman I hung out with, and he had a saying. He said, "Well, there's a lot of nibble in there. They've got more. They'll be okay for a day or 2 days or whatever." And I don't know if you know Dr. Lemkuhler, a peer of Dr. Halich's, and he came out and he said, "Dave, you need to be moving them faster." So, I took that and I started paying attention, and then I learned real quick how my regrowth moved along a lot faster. So that make them clean it up, that is not the ticket, and we'll see some data here in a second. But I want to show this. I don't know, does anybody have any thoughts when they see this picture? Is there anything you think about? Say what? Johnson grass. Yeah. Johnson grass might have headed out by the time it's that tall, but it's at least a warm season, and it might be like a sorghum Sudan, but look at all these stems. And to her point about it being Johnson grass, or something like that, look down here. There's no blade down there. So when they go into this thing, they're going to be eaten up high, and I love Johnson grass, by the way, and when I put my cows in and it's like this, just before it starts to head out, they'll go to here quick, and then you have to move them. So if you hear people say, put your cows in when it's knee high and take them out when it's ankle high, that's another, gauge that people use on moving cows. That just doesn't work. So it does depend on what your forage is. But anyhow, and I don't want to criticize this person too much, so maybe he did this for a reason, he or she. But there's nothing left over there but stem. So these cows are probably going to suffer on, these steers or feeders, they're going to suffer on animal performance, and at least. So if you had a cow-calf operation, you're gonna see some reduced performance, lower weaning weights, lower breeding rates. It's important, to keep your females well fed, and health problems. There's the potential like pink eye, or hopefully that's all. If you don't feed them well enough, don't give them enough to graze, it could be even worse than that. Did you want to say something about this, Greg?
Let me back up here. So very quickly, so in my experience, this pushing the cattle too hard is probably the number one problem I see from people, both experienced and particularly new, some that's in their first 5 years of, say, rotational grazing. That is by far the number one problem I see is people push the cattle too hard, they're making them clean up. And in terms of these three problems that you have, and we're concentrating on a cow-calf operation here, the bottom two are extremely difficult to really see. In other words, those are long-term problems, and you don't really know why they occurred. So if your breeding rate goes from, say, 85 to 60% from one year to the next, in most cases, you really have no clue. Was it the bull? Was it the heat? You really have no idea. So, and the same with health problems. And Dave mentioned pink eye, but I'm a firm believer that the main cause of pink eye is some nutritional deficiency, and a lot of times probably that's mineral deficiency. But it's also lagged. You will never see pink eye, from my experience, within a few weeks of that problem. It will be months. So the point being is those are very difficult to see, but they're often caused by the very reason we're looking at here, people pushing their cattle too hard, whether it's during the grazing season or during the winter, and they're trying to force them to clean up too much hay. What I'm going to show you now, so in that previous picture, it was fall, right, and with the cow. And by the way, that was from a friend of mine in Virginia who took that picture. I've seen a couple cattle here in Kentucky do the same thing. One of them was on one of my farms, but he wasn't starving. He just learned that after the first couple hours, he could get underneath that fence. He did the same thing, but he was not starved. So it's not always indicative of that. But that, at least in the fall, when they took that picture, think about there was a benefit of pushing their cattle. It's very small, but what were they gaining by pushing their cattle? Getting a few more grazing days in late October. Not feeding hay. So in other words, if they got 2 or 3 more grazing days, they reduce 3 days of feeding hay. Now it's a benefit, but there is a huge cost. So I'm not saying you definitely don't want to do that, but at least there's some benefit there, right? What about this picture here? I'm going to show you the date now. And this is a farm that I've been working with for about 6 years. This was 2 years ago, I believe. Yeah. So April 25th. I would argue this is a bigger problem here than the previous picture. What are they gaining by pushing those cattle in late April? Late April, the grass is usually starting to do what? Take off, right? And you can see that there on the left-hand side. So why on earth would you push your cattle in late April or early May? What are you gaining? Nothing. And I can say this because there's no one from this farm here, but they push their cattle really hard through the wintertime. Let's just say they have less than perfect quality hay, probably average, but what I would consider not good. And so the cattle are coming out of winter in rough shape. And then finally, when you've got good grass, so by late April, you should be really gaining on breeding stock or anything. And so if you're pushing them like that, are they gaining weight? Are they gaining all the fat reserves? They should be building fat at this time. I can promise you on this farm at this time, they were not doing that. So that's actually, in my opinion, the worst time that you can try to push those cattle. All right.
Okay, so we've kind of hit that. The reduced animal performance from overutilization. So, and then the other thing is the reduced pasture growth that we referred to a minute ago. So here's a chart, depending on, let me back up. So don't worry too much. This is pounds per acre per day. And, you what? Oh, thank you. Pounds per acre per day, and none of us talk about that way, right? We don't measure pasture growth that way. But the important point here is if you're getting it to the point of where that cow was reaching under the fence and you're, oh good, I used it all, I got it down to there. You're at 2 inches. Here's your pasture grazing height. So you're at 2 inches. So you get up to, let's say, the low 30s. Use these as relative numbers. And right there, 2 inches versus 6 inches, okay? So if you're leaving 6 inches of residual, you're up at around 55. All right? So 25 pounds per acre per day of difference in the gain if you're just leaving the residual. So, you know, I don't know how many of you are gardeners, but picking peas, if you know, the more you pick them, the more they grow. And it's very similar to that with pasture growth. The more you leave, within reason, the faster it's going to come back. So that's actually a 40% decrease. All right. So, did you want to say something about that? So, Jim Garish's Grazers Anonymous group mantra, I will have no fear of wasting grass. So, you know, just like me, when Dr. Lemkuhler came out, and I'm sitting there thinking, good, I took advantage of all that grass and I just moved them. And I think Dr. Lemkuhler's exact words were, yeah, I'd have moved them 3 days ago. So I got away from that real fast, thinking that I had to leave them on there and utilize all that grass. I don't, at this point, I don't have any fear of walking away when there's plenty of grass there. And along that line, I'll make a point that April 25th picture that Greg showed, I usually, in my mind, there's that 8th to 15th of April on my farm. That's when I start, I take them away from feeding hay in the winter and I go to my rotational grazing. I try to keep them off the paddocks until that point. That late April, there is, it's just move, you know. 1 or 2 days, there's no way that that grass has been used, but all you're trying to do at that point is just keep ahead of it. So you're just topping it and moving them and trying to stay away from grass getting over mature. So, you want to take that?
All right, so I'm going to say in general, so remember the slide where he showed roughly 6-inch residual is going to basically give you the most pasture growth over, and that was, by the way, that was work Jim Garish did in Missouri probably 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. And it was over, I think, 4 or 5 years that they did that. And I guess one point I should make is you're never going to get exactly 6 inches or 4 inches or whatever, right? It's going to be a mix, and you've got to kind of look at the average. But in general, the point we're trying to make is it's completely true. The more, not the more, but say around 6 inches is ideal in terms of that balance where you're going to get the most growth. But there's also a problem with doing that year in, year out, and this is what I'm going to share with you here. So I'm guessing everyone in here has a lot of fescue in their pastures. We're pretty much in the heart of the fescue belt here. And the problem, and I noticed this years ago, and I was in Virginia with a bunch of county agents, and we talked about this, but basically kind of what a lot of people think is just good rotational grazing over a period of years will start favoring fescue. So what I'm going to show you here is just some techniques to kind of break that up. So in general, you'll probably want to go to around 6-inch residual. That's going to change from time to time. And it's definitely exacerbated by what I call top third grazing. So that's roughly where you're taking about a third, say 33 to 40% of the biomass each rotation, which will help with animal performance. But what it ends up doing long term is it's really going to let the fescue thrive, because when you do that, when you're only taking, say, 30 to 40%, the animals will favor the clover, the orchard grass, bluegrass over the fescue. So over time, you've got to do something to deal with that. Now, one is, and we'll talk about this a little later on, is you can use clipping strategically to help in that process. And that's what I do because I finish animals on my farm, so I can't push them very, very hard. But what I will show you is some techniques with a cow herd, hopefully not a finishing herd, that you can actually do it with grazing. So this is what I call shaking up. And I'm not a proponent of mob grazing, at least all the time, but I know some of you probably are either doing it or wondering about it. So all I can say is, if you're going to do mob grazing, and I'm not going to go into details on that. If you know what mob grazing is, if you don't, talk to me afterwards. But basically, don't do it all the time. Do it strategically. If you do it all the time, I can promise you your animal performance will be really bad. So in my words, occasionally. So Greg Brand is not here. I don't think he's going to be here later in the day. But I learned a lot of, especially in my early years, from Greg Brand. And he came up with this term years ago. I heard him tell me this, but he calls it boom and bust grazing. And basically what he means by that is most of the time you're going to do things like we should be doing, like the 6 inches, plenty to recover, et cetera. But occasionally you really want to hammer a pasture to kind of set it back. In other words, to set the fescue back. And also clover, especially white clover, really needs close grazing for it to kind of take off. So that boom and bust grazing, so again, occasionally there's different ways you can hammer that pasture, but occasionally you really want to hammer the heck out of that pasture to set it back. Again, not all the time, not chronically, but occasionally to do that. And there's multiple ways to do that, but occasionally you need to do that. My favorite way, personally, my favorite way of doing that, and by the way, mob grazing can be a form of boom and bust grazing. You're doing it very intensely for a short period of time. I can't do that with my finishing animals, or I can't do it for very long because performance will drop dramatically when you do mob grazing. So the way I do it is I just leave the cattle on a particular pasture longer, but what I do is I start bale grazing at very low density, and we'll talk about bale grazing later on, and that the bales that you set out bale grazing essentially is a buffer. So in other words, when the cattle start getting hungry, when they're hitting the pasture too hard, when they take it below 4 inches, they're not going to have enough intake, or they're not going to have as much as you want. The hay will provide a buffer in that process. We're going to go through this section. Let me see what we're doing. We're a little bit behind, and so I'm going to probably go through this section a little bit quicker than I want to. But that's the last section, unfortunately. The fifth thing that we're going to show you is probably the thing that most people are going to want to be here for. So I want to make sure I have plenty of time for that. So legumes are a key in a biological system, at least initially. We'll talk long run. I'll argue you really don't need that many legumes once your organic matter is up really high. And we'll get to that at the very end of the presentation. But in the short run, most people are going to want to figure out some way to incorporate legumes into most pastures, especially if it's until at least you get 4.5%, 5% organic matter. And I'll talk a little bit about forbs. So long run, that's going to be clover for most people. And we're not going to spend any time in terms of how to incorporate clovers, how to get a good clover stand. There are lots of extension presentations you can go to hear that. I'm going to give you one technique that I think is highly underutilized, especially with an organic system where you're not going to use any commercial fertilizer. And I'll focus on that, and then we'll talk a little bit about forbs. And that's annual Lesbodisa. So does anyone here use annual Lesbodisa? No one in here. Everyone in here should be using annual Lesbodisa at least on a part of their acres. And I want to be clear, annual Lesbodisa is not Sericea Lesbodisa. Sericea Lesbodisa is a perennial. It's a poor forage for the most part, except for maybe goats. Annual Lesbodisa is a very high quality. It's an annual. You either have to seed it or it will reseed itself to a certain extent. This is typically how it's used in a perennial system. So this was on rental ground on one of my farms. It was actually pretty good soil. It just had been abused for 10, 20 years. So fertility was low. And basically, you just frost seed annual Lesbodisa like you would clover. It is a warm season legume. I'm not going to go into details of how to do it, but it's a warm season legume, so it is very frost sensitive. That is key. You can't seed it as early as you do clover, but you can broadcast seed it, and that's how I do it. So that's typically how it's used most of the time. So you're going to broadcast it into existing pasture. Ideally, it's only going to work well for 2 or 3 years, because as the fertility of that pasture increases, the grass will crowd it out and the clover will crowd it out. So it's what I call a bridge legume. It will help you get through that process of bringing that pasture back to life. And that's what it looked like in that. And I'm going to go through this quick. Just again, let me go back here. All right. So that's the most common way that it is currently used. This used to be the most common way that was used in Kentucky. So in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we every year would plant 2 to 3 million acres of this in Kentucky. So more than we have total combined acres in corn and soybeans today, we'd have pretty much pure stands of annual Lesbodisa. They would typically double crop it with a winter annual, something like wheat that they would typically harvest that for a grain. But then they'd have this pure stand of annual Lespedeza either as for a hay crop or for summer grazing, because it's gonna be doing its best in July and August when typically pastures are what? At their worst, right? So it fills in beautifully. This was a farm that does both cattle and grain production, conventional both, but I've been working with them on bale grazing. And this was right after the ethanol grain boom, and they're starting to take some land, marginal crop ground that they just put in crop ground during that time, out of production. They're bringing it back into the livestock rotation. And I convinced them to try a pure stand of annual Lespedeza just because reading about it, I knew it worked well in pasture situation. My gut feeling is it would do well like we used to do millions of acres. This was about a 30-acre field. You can see it took beautifully. There are a few weeds in there, but not many. If you randomly, 9 out of 10 times, if you put a grazing stick into it, it looked just like that. And that was very beginning of July. 10 days later when I came back, it was about 20 inches on the grazing stick. They should have actually cut it for hay. It got away from them. But I will say this, I've never seen a cow herd come off in late August with as beautiful happy lines as I saw on this farm. It was just the most incredible forage during that time. And again, you can double crop it. So in other words, what I'm getting at here is in an organic system, if you're doing a lot of rotations, this would be a really good forage to include in that rotation. And in fall, probably it depends when you're drilling, or if you're drilling or broadcasting, but sometime in the fall, you can put a winter annual into that. Here it's a mixture of rye and crimson clover, and you essentially can double crop it and graze it. So the other thing that I've really been experimenting heavily the last 5 years or so are various forbs. And the two that I like the most, and I'll show you those here in a second. Well, I'll just give you all the ones that I use. So chicory, I'll show you a picture of that. So I'm drawing arrows. So that picture, there was a mixture of chicory, plantain, annual Lespedeza. So there's chicory. The other one is plantain, and there's pictures pointing to the plantain. Those are improved forage varieties. So there are wild varieties. Obviously, these are improved forage varieties. And all I can tell you is they're wonderful. I'll tell you why I think that. But they only work in limited situations. You can't do it all the time. The one I'm experimenting with, so I'm saying that because I'm not sure how well it's going to work out. I think it's going to work really well, is a forb called Burnett. And I'm, again, just for the last year, I've started using that, and probably give me 2 more years, I'll tell you if that's worth the time. But definitely chicory and plantain are worth using. Wild varieties that I've never been able to find seed for that are great forbs are giant ragweed. And just to be clear, because Dave he thought I was talking about common ragweed. So common ragweed gets really tall, right? So that's not giant ragweed. Giant ragweed is a different variety. And I never even knew it existed until I was in Missouri, and there's a farmer there that showed me how well the cattle liked it. And giant ragweed, if you know how to manage it, it can increase in your stands, and it's a wonderful forb. But for the most part, it's just if it's there, they will utilize it. And then dandelion is another one that cattle will hit, generally in the spring. Importance of forbs, this is probably the key, they're all deep-rooted. So in other words, they can get way down in the soil profile and pull up minerals that may not be available for most plants. So they're mineral rich. Now, as far as I know, there's been very few actual research studies to look at this, but a lot of people, and I'm one of them included, that I believe that is really beneficial to animal health. On the one farm, I have a lot of these forbs on. I haven't had a pink eye case in 4 years or so. I can't say for sure it's because of that, but it's just, I think we do have quite a few benefits like that. They're also just really good forages, high in energy and protein. And then lastly, I think animals just like a variety in their diet sometimes. So it's good for that. This is the biggest problem, is getting those established. So it's almost, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's extremely difficult to do in perennial pasture situations where it's already established. So again, with organic systems, you have a rotation where you're taking it out of something, mix it in when basically you have no competition. The key is they can't tolerate much competition when they're establishing. Those seeds are, Burnett's exception, but most of those forb seeds are tiny, smaller than white clover. So they really can't tolerate any significant competition when they're germinating and starting to establish. Once they're about 2 or 3 inches high, they can take a fair amount of competition in terms of not having a lot of sunlight. So bare ground works great, damaged areas. So when I bale graze, which I do on both farms, in my bale grazing mix, I see just the areas that were bale grazed. I always put a lot of forbs in those. And you might be able to suppress the forages enough to get it into perennial pasture. I've just not had any luck. So in other words, you can try it. I wouldn't put out a few $100s at a time though. Try it small and see what you can do. Hopefully this picture will show you why forbs can be so beneficial. So on the left and far right, that's chicory on the left and that's plantain on the right. Can you all see why they might be mineral rich compared to our typical clover and most grasses? And yeah, tall fescue is going to have a little bit bigger root system than the perennial ryegrass, but it's going to be nowhere near either of those. So clipping, and we'll talk about clipping and weed management here. So I'm a big proponent of clipping. I know some people don't want to waste fuel, but again, I have a finishing operation and I just can't push my cattle very hard. So I rely on clipping, not a lot, in what I would call strategic clipping, but we'll talk a little bit about that. But let me first kind of give you my philosophy on why I clip weeds. And it's not just to suppress the weeds. You can actually use, if you clip those weeds at the right time, that means they're still vegetative, they're not all carbon, you can actually feed the soil biology, just like we're going to talk about bale grazing. And that's probably the primary reason I like to clip weeds, is I want to, especially on poor farms that you're trying to bring back to life, you will feed the biology by doing that. And so let me read a quote here. This is by Sir Albert Howard, a British agriculturalist in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And this will help you understand my philosophy on why I clip weeds. So the destruction of a pest is the evasion of, rather than the solution of, all agricultural problems. Now, I would say he was probably a little bit strong in his wording, but if I change that slightly to say maybe most agricultural problems, I would agree with that. So what is he trying to say with that statement? Why is he being so adamant about that? Yes, and I think so. There's a cycle that hasn't been completed. So let me paraphrase maybe what he's trying to say, and I think it's probably exactly what you're getting at. So I think what Sir Albert Howard is trying to say is, if you shoot the messenger before you are able to receive the message, you will never eliminate those weeds. You will in the short run. In other words, if you can spray those weeds and you can completely kill them out, and that is common ragweed that you're looking at there. I could have completely killed out that ragweed. I would have also killed out all the lesbidia below it probably. But I can promise you, unless I correct the underlying problems that are pushing those weeds up, and pretty much every weed, 90% of the time, is indication of underlying problems, either management-based or fertility-based or some combination of those two. And if you don't correct those underlying problems, those weeds will be back in 2 or 3 years, even if you kill them out completely by spraying today. So in the short run, so I'm not promoting weedy pastures or weedy hayfields. What I'm saying is, until you correct the problems that are causing that, you can use those weeds to feed the soil biology, and wonderful things can happen. And Dave, please chime in here, because I think Dave and I both have a similar philosophy to this, and this is just what works for us. And so you all may have a different system that does work. We're just trying to tell you what has worked for both of us. So I like to clip all my pastures at least once, and I do that in late spring, early summer. So I'm going to say ideally to me that's between mid-May and early June. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes that early June goes into mid-June, or even hopefully not too much past that. But to me, that's the ideal time to clip. And by the way, when I clip, it's always when the cattle are off. As soon as they come off the pasture, or shortly after they come off the pasture, I'm clipping them. I'm not clipping the whole thing at one time. But the key here is you want to clip early on before the grass starts slowing down. Because if you can clip really low at that time of year before the grass slows down, and it will rebound very quickly. But if you wait until late June, early July, when the grass starts slowing down, and if you clip it low, it'll take forever for that to come back. And to me, that's one mistake I used to make, but I didn't clip low enough in the first time. This changes later in the season. But if you get on it before, again, mid-June or so, and you've got healthy pastures, they'll come back really quick, even if you clip it down to 4 inches. So remember how we said if you consistently leave a lot of residual, what will happen? Long run, fescue will take over, right? So this is one reason, and I learned this over probably a period of 5 or 6 years. Every year I kept clipping a little bit lower because I was afraid that grass wouldn't come back. But I found I can clip it as low as 4 inches, again, as long as I get on it by early June, and it will come back quickly. Last year was probably an exception because we had a bad drought in June, but 9 out of 10 years it will come back very quickly. And then we both like to clip it late summer, early fall. Again, your exact dates may change a little bit, but to me that's kind of mid-August to mid-September. And the key here is at that time of year, I typically want to clip a lot higher. So I'm not, for better or worse, there's a whole lot more risk clipping low at that time than there is in the spring. Would you all agree? So that's the key there. If I knew I was going to have the next month, I was going to have ideal rainfall conditions, I would probably not take it to 4 inches, but maybe 5, 6 inches. But I kind of hedge my bets at that time. So I'm trying to clip those summer weeds. Again, convert that to food for the soil biology. But you're gambling if you go below that. Dave, you have anything to add?
I really like that mid-August to September just to get, I've got a tall ironweed problem, and I like to make sure that's not going to seed. So that's.
And that's the perfect time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. By the way, for both clipping pastures for fertility, building fertility, and also for a really good discussion on forbs, using forbs in livestock diet, this is one of the best books I've ever seen, Newman Turner. Just incredible. The only thing I will say, this is in Great Britain, so obviously their climate is a lot different. So a lot of the specific, say, varieties that he's recommending, but the concepts work very well, and I highly recommend this. This is probably my #1 favorite book on cattle grazing management. All right, bale grazing. So Dave is going to take this over. Let me see how we're doing on time. Keenan, how much time do we have left? So how many minutes?
47.
Yeah, and then some time for Q&A if you want.
How much time do we have left total?
7 plus
47? Okay, we're doing good then. All right, I thought we were running, so we must have made up some of that time. So I think we're okay. You're saying? Okay. All right, so I think we're good on time. So let me preface this. So Dave started bale grazing 5 years ago?
2018.
2018. He learned very quickly. So I will just say a lot of people, it takes 3-4 years to kind of get everything rolling. I think it took Dave about 2 years and he had everything rolling. So excellent person to learn from. Also, before I forget, Megan McCown in Franklin County, she bale grazed here at KSU for 3 winters. She also, about 2 years, she had it mastered. So either of those are great references if you want to learn about bale grazing from one of those.
All right. Has anybody heard of bale grazing? No, a couple? Anybody doing it? One? Maybe? Okay. All right, good. Yeah.
So Dave's going to do most of this. This is a short introduction to bale grazing. You are not going to know how to bale graze well by looking at this. So think of this as just an introduction, whet your appetite, but that's all it is. So be careful. In other words, there are 101 ways to screw up bale grazing, and most people will find at least half of those screwed up. So if you're interested in bale grazing, please do not just take what you see here and think you can bale graze well. Get a hold of one of us that have done it.
Yeah. So I'll preface this, and I've got to give all the credit to Greg for, he's the one that got me started on it. This is, so I've been running cattle for 23, 24 years up, at this location. This is the #1 best thing that I've ever done on the farm for improving soil health and bumping up my organic matter. So I second what he said. I would talk to you or come to your farm or whatever you needed, and I know Greg would too. But so here's what bale grazing is. So you start with a water source, and in this case, this is one of my paddocks. There's a water source over here to the left that you can't see, and there was actually another row of bales. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but right here there's an electric fence wire. You can see it running through that little patch of weeds. And it's very similar to rotational grazing in that you are limit feeding a certain number of bales. And so there was, let's just say, well, in fact, I can see some cow pies right here. So the cows were over here. That little calf, he's doing some creep grazing. He got under the fence. But, and then there's going to be another right about here, there'll be another electric wire. And the reason we do 2 electric wires is that if something would happen and they would knock down this first one, you know what they're going to do. They're going to go hit every bale in the field and start ripping it apart rather than just that first row. So there's 2 fences. And the only reason is it's a just in case. So I'm mostly going to talk about winter bale grazing, our normal hay feeding period. There are reasons to do it spring or fall. Let's just say in the fall and there's a drought, you might want to do some bale grazing and save your stockpiled paddocks, for example. But what we're going to talk about here is just mostly the winter. So you've got a water source, you start there, you set out a certain number of bales, and you're setting out, in my case, the way I do it, I set out a month of bales at one time. And I usually start right around December 3rd to 5th. That's just me. It doesn't mean that's where everybody has to start. And then at the end of that 30 days, I'm looking for a real cold or real dry period where I can set out another month. All right? And so here's one other thing I do. You can see all the residual. So it's not really a stockpiled paddock, but there's a lot of residual. And I like to set my bales in there, and that gives them a little bit of something to pick at, and then the hay to eat. And like Greg said, we're not going to be able to tell you everything, but I think one of the biggest things is don't go too heavy on the amount of hay per paddock that you're 2 tons per acre when you start. I highly recommend. As you get better, you can bump that up, and you can play around with it. But let's say the first 2 years start with 2 tons per acre. So this is that same. I was over there taking a picture that way. This one, it's the same paddock, and you can see all that residual is gone. And the other thing you can see is it's hard for me to focus right now, but there's bale spots where there had been bales sitting, and they're gone now. And I don't want you to think, when I look at this, and I don't see any residual hay, I think, oh my God. I knew a guy that his saying was, I'm going to leave them there till they clean that up. Well, once again, that's wrong. But in my case, I try to make good hay, and I think if it's good hay, they're going to eat it to the ground. So the little bit left there ends up going away pretty quickly. And this is what really turns my crank about bale grazing. This is one of my paddocks, and they just left. Okay, so I've taken them elsewhere, and look at that manure distribution. That is so they're pooping and peeing right where you want it. All that stuff is right on the paddocks that you're going to be using this next summer. And feeding pad, I don't care if you spread the manure or not, you're going to lose all the urine. And my understanding is that the urine is 60% of the benefit that you get what's coming out of the cow. So all the urine is going where it's supposed to, all the manure is going where it's supposed to, and that is all NP and K that's going on the field. Okay. I want to say one thing. I've got way on the other end of the farm, I've got a number 6 paddock, and I had a broom sedge problem. Everybody knows what broom sedge is? And a couple things happened. But when I bale grazed that paddock, and my county agent actually made the comment to me. He said, have you noticed the difference in broom sedge from pre-bale grazing to post? And is it phosphorus? Yeah, but what we were thinking is phosphorus. But anyhow, it dramatically reduced the broom sedge problem. So, biological fertility, and I don't know if you want to say something about this, but so what you're looking at is, the residual hay, and there's value in that. You've got the manure and the urine, and yeah, that's NPK. But one of the things I have seen is that in 2014, when I started real seriously rotationally grazing, my organic matter, I started testing for organic matter, and it started coming up, but slowly. When I started bale grazing, I started taking bigger leaps. 2014 was 2.5. I went several years, and I was able to get it up. About 2018, I was able to get it up around 3.5. And then I'm up around 5 now. 4.8, 4.9 were my last organic matter tests. And I think that the biological fertility, all the bugs, bacteria, funguses, insects, all that. And I know, are you going to play those videos? Okay, that Virginia. Okay, so I'm going to tell a quick story. So my second year of bale grazing, Dr. Halich came out, and I started paddock number 1, December 5th, about a month on 2. He came out 1st of February. We were on number 3, and we got discussing. I said something about, did you notice there's no manure showing on number 1? That picture you saw with the widespread manure. There's no manure on number 1. There's a little bit on number 2, and then number 3 where they were, there was a lot. And I was scratching my head. I said, we haven't had that much rain or whatever. And Dr. Halich said, well, let's walk back there. And we saw that progression. We came back into number 2. He said, I think I know what it is. He started flipping over cow pies, and it was loaded with dung beetles. And I tell this story to farmers, and for some reason they don't get it, but that's all these nutrients. That's money, That's everything being pulled down into the ground. And I don't know when that got started. I wish I would have known when I started testing and it was at 2.5% organic matter, what was that bug activity like? But I know that when we got up around 3.5, it was pretty significant. So all that's going on. Here, a couple things real quick. I'll try to move along, but soil compaction. So before I started doing this, and it was the reason I got into bale grazing, I had a sacrifice lot like most people in Kentucky do. At the time I had a 2-wheel drive tractor. I had to worry about getting stuck. The cows were a muddy mess. And I know it's snowing right now, but there's no mud on those cows. And that's not just an aesthetic thing. I think when the cows are covered with mud, it takes more calories to stay warm. Not only that, if you've ever tried to flip a hay ring and you got your muck boots on, think how much energy that takes. And those cows, in a non-bale grazing situation, they're going to be fighting that mud, hock deep, whatever. And so I think it helps me keep my cows in better shape, protects. And yes, I get a little pugging around the hay rings, but as we will tell you over and over again, it's so brief that it's just a surface. And you'll see a couple spots here, but so I'll come back to that. Labor and fuel savings. So once a month, I spend 2.5 or 3 hours. It depends on what paddocks I'm in and how far the hay is. And it's real simple. 2 or 3 hours, and I'm done. Setting hay out. And then so in my case, and this was just experiment, but it became crystal clear to me in a heartbeat. At about 26 cows, I think I was on 6 bales every 4 days, and I ended up going up to 34, 35 cows. Oh, and by the way, with calves, 8 bales, 4 days, and it's just like it's cleaned up, and you go out there the 4th day, and they stand at the wire, and they're telling you they're ready to move. So right off the bat, if you look at what I just told you and you do the math, it's 7 hours a month versus 15 hours a month, because if you're setting out hay every day, it's got to be at least 30 minutes. All right? Yeah. Say what? Hay rings? I've got quite a few.
Do you cross them, or do you just double?
Oh, no, so I put hay rings on the 8 that they're eating.
Okay.
And then I drop a wire, roll the hay rings, and I do all that on foot, okay? I don't, once I set out the hay with the tractor, I don't go back out there. Not until it's time to set out the next hay.
With the tractor.
Yeah.
So I need to apologize. There's one other bale grazer in here that learned very quickly and is doing just as good a job as the rest of that. That's Mike Wilson right here. So Mike is a former mechanic, and he actually has another very good reason why setting hay out once a month or once every 2 months for a number of hours is a whole lot. There's another benefit doing that versus 15 or 20 minutes every day. Mike, you want to mention that to him?
Well, when you start your tractor and run it for 15 or 20 minutes, or a car or any kind of gas engine, at 15 or 20 minutes, it's just enough for that engine to start sweating. And when it sweats, it's going to cause condensation inside the engine, which is going to get in your motor oil and cause sludge buildup and stuff in your engine. When you run that tractor for a half hour or an hour till it reaches normal operating temperature, it dries that sweat out and you don't have that problem.
So yet another reason why typical feeding where you're out there every 1 or 2
Yeah.
days for a short period of time is also costly.
And I'll tell you one other thing that I've thought of along that line of that sacrifice lot and all that mud is I have found that when it's like this instead of muddy, I get out there every day and walk around because I enjoy it. And I'm able to walk closer to the cows. I walk around them and I can see them real close. So big fan to all that. So real quick, as I talk to people about bale grazing, there's always a few of the same things that come up, questions. And so I put them down here, and I'll just go over them real quick. Will the hay rot? I had one guy said, I store my hay inside all summer long, and I'm not going to set it outside for a month and let it rot right at the last minute. Well, December, when it starts to turn cold, the biological activity goes down so fast, I don't see hardly any degradation in the hay, all right? So don't worry about that. Will I have a lot of damage to the pastures? There's one thing in this picture I want you to see. See that water standing there? This picture was like worst case. It had just been raining and raining and raining. And I got to apologize for the quality of the picture. It was part of a video that I stopped and took one of the frames. But you do see a little bit of, there is a little bit of damage. But again, I'm telling you, it's not real deep. So there might be a little bit of, if you want to call it compaction, but it heals up real quick. Repairing the areas, Dr. Halich and I both, when we're bale grazing in the spring, we go out with a hand seeder and we do some different mixes. I don't get fancy at all. It's just maybe a little bit of rye with some clover, and I just walk around to all the spots that have been bale grazed, and I hit them, whether there's hay in the middle or the little dirt part. It doesn't matter. I just hit them, and oops, I forgot one, didn't I? Oh, will weeds become a problem? Again, Greg put me on that. He said, when you look at the whole scope of it and you've got a few weeds right where that bale was, you know, is that really a big deal? And the answer is no, because we do that seeding. The first year, you know, you can see a couple weeds, and then it just gets run out by the good forage. And as a matter of fact, the best areas in the pasture end up being right where those bales were. So that's the chemical and the biological fertility combining. And then moving hay rings, like we talked about, I put the 8, you know, on the 34 cows, I put 8 hay rings down. I pull up the fence and leapfrog it, move the hay rings, and I'm done. And no tractor till the next month. So, use in organic systems, I'm going to let Dr. Halich.
And before I'm going to add one thing to what Dave said. So one of the biggest concerns I have with farmers who are interested in bale grazing is they're worried, like Dave said, that they're going to mess up their pastures. And remember at the very beginning, I told you all what? You're getting an introduction to this, right? And so you do need a whole lot more information. But if done wrong, yes, you can, let me assure you, you can screw up your pasture. So again, if you're interested in bale grazing, now you have 4 different people you can contact, or your county agent can put us get a hold of one of us. But the number one, this is just very quick, but the number one reason that most people will screw up their pastures is they're feeding way too much hay per acre. So Dave said 2 tons the acre. That's in general what I tell people. I actually feed less than that now. I usually, most of my pastures, I'll feed more like 1 ton to the acre. But if you get beyond 2 tons an acre when it starts getting wet, you can do a lot of damage here in Kentucky. So most people, if they look at bale grazing, they find a video, YouTube video. It's probably going to be in Saskatchewan, British Columbia, North Dakota, somewhere that is frozen for 6 or 7 months solid. Yeah, they can have bales from me to this gentleman away, which you'll see in the videos, and they won't damage those pastures because they're frozen solid. We don't have that, for better or worse, here in Kentucky. So number one problem, don't do that.
Excuse me, what about, have you ever used a penetrometer on it to see what it is around the hay?
Yeah, I think the question is, do you get compaction? And the answer is yes. If it's wet, when the cattle are around a particular bale, you will have compaction, no ifs, ands, or buts. Now that's short run, and long run, and again, this is an introduction, so we can talk later if you want, but I have a really good seeding mix for helping that. The 2 key ingredients I've found are plantain and chicory. You all saw the taproots on those. And when you have compaction, when it was wet, the same seeding mix I use everywhere. One bale when it wasn't, where it was really dry when I fed will be mostly clover, annual lesbideza. A bale that was compacted that had a lot of mud will be about 90% plantain and chicory. It's because they're the only things that can break through that compaction. So yes, you will have short-term compaction. It's going to be in a small area. It's going to be less than 1% of the pasture if you're feeding it 2 tons the acre. But even there, I've got enough German blood in me where I don't want any weeds, or I want very few weeds, and I don't want any compaction. So I'm going to get rid of that as quick as I can. So here, yes? You're talking about Dave. Can we get back to that at the very end? Just because I'm afraid we're going to, I think the most valuable part will be the biological component. This is a problem with bale grazing. I've had 30 minutes at the end of the presentation. So just whatever time we'll have, we'll answer those questions. And if we run out of time, we'll talk one-on-one. So what I'm going to show you here, who here also does vegetables or organic row crops? A few of you. Okay. So I do not, I have a big vegetable garden, but I don't do it commercially. But if I had a commercial vegetable garden, or if I was doing organic grain, and I did row crops for about 10 years, not organically, but the rental ground that I cropped on was about 5 miles from where I had cattle, so I wasn't able to do this. But if I had an organic grain or vegetable production, this is what I would consider doing. I think you could use bale grazing as a way to essentially put back chemical and biological fertility. You want to be very careful though. So if I'm going to do that, I'm not ever going to be in there when it's wet. So only when it's dry or frozen, and when it gets wet, I'm going to move the cattle out. And ideally, I'm going to have a pasture adjacent to that I'm bale grazing also, that the cattle get moved back into there until the conditions are suited. So I've not done this personally. I'm just throwing this out as an idea. And if you're interested in doing this, contact me, because I would love to work with a few people doing this and measuring the chemical and biological changes in that soil. But my guess is it would work very well. I think all of you have access to our summary slides. In those summary slides, you'll have 2 URLs. So Dave's is at the top. It's more of a, it was Virginia Forage and Grassland Council that came up and interviewed both of us. But it's a good one to see about Dave and his operation, how he integrated bale grazing. The bottom one is an actual, my kind of typical 50-minute bale grazing presentation that goes into a lot more detail than what you saw today. So that's an easy one. It's YouTube video, but it'll literally, it's a good introduction, more than our 15 minutes that we've done here. So please go to that if you're interested. The other thing I want to point out is I am leading a 6-state project on bale grazing. This is our first winter that we're starting, but we're going to do this for 5 years. We'll have over 100 farms total by the end of those 5 years. If you're interested in being a demo farm, we're going to be looking for some every year in Kentucky for the next 4 years. Contact me about that, because we are going to be looking for some volunteers. All right, so the last thing, and how are we doing on time, Keenan? Okay, so we have plenty of time, so we should have lots of time at the end for some of those questions. This is what I think is going to be why most of you are here. So I want to make sure I have plenty of time for this. And Dave is going to interject whenever he feels like it. So I will preface this by saying, if I was up here and I'd have to go back and look, but for sure 6 years ago and probably 5 years ago, I would be clueless about this. So I've learned a lot about biological fertility, soil health. My learning curve is still really steep, and I'm sure a lot of people here know a lot of aspects about this that probably more than I do. So let me just preface all this by saying that. So I will show you what I've learned, and Dave will show you what kind of he has learned also about biological activity and also organic matter. So most of you probably know all this, so I'm just going to hit the highlights. Benefits of organic matter. The biggest one probably, and some people don't realize this, is that when you start getting high organic matter in your soil, every year, assuming you've got decent to good to excellent biological activity, it's mineralizing nitrogen from that organic matter. In other words, part of that organic matter actually breaks down every year. It should. If it's not, you have no biological activity going on. But the key is you want to be building organic matter quicker than the biology is breaking it down. That's a natural process. So in high organic matter soils, you are going to naturally have a lot of nitrogen release by that biological activity. That's one key. That may be the number one key. The other part of that, and this is why it's so good for organic systems, is if I put down, say, 105 pounds of urea in the spring, which is roughly 50 units of nitrogen, when is all that's going to be used on a pasture by when? Probably within 60 days. 95% of it, 60 days. Do you want to have a ton of forage in the spring and nothing in the summertime? I want more of it in the summer if I can. So the nice thing about that is it's actually the inverse of chemical N. Biology in the early spring is actually slow, so it's breaking down the organic matter slower at that time, and it's not until late May and early June where it really starts cycling up the biological activity and starts releasing that nitrogen. About the time your pastures can probably use it or need it more. So it's actually in a better form than commercial fertilizer. And here's, again, 5 years ago, I'd have had no clue on this. So when I say organic matter here, I mean the organic matter in the soil, not organic matter that we might add to the pasture. But the organic matter in the soil is also food for the biology, and that's essentially why that nitrogen is being mineralized, right? The biology is breaking down part of the organic matter every year. That's what's causing the mineralization of nitrogen and other nutrients. So it's feed for our biological organisms. And the last one, and all of you know this, is the higher the organic matter in your soil, the more water that soil can hold. This last year, that was probably really important, is my guess for most people. And that's when high organic matter is really going to shine, where I can spot, I can go out on a farm about 3 weeks into a drought, and I can tell about how much organic matter they have if I know roughly how long a pasture is left, just because, again, the more organic matter, the more water that's going to be left in that soil. So building organic matter, and these are just real basic stuff. I'm not going to detail here, but a big chunk of it for what we're doing in terms of livestock systems is just good grazing practices. That is kind of the key that Dave got started, and he told you that before he got into doing bale grazing, his organic matter started coming up. That was just from good basic grazing practices. And again, the key, I would boil it down to two things. Again, most of the time I'm leaving plenty of residual, but occasionally we have to what? We have to shake it up, right? We take it down. But the bulk of the time we need a fair amount of residual, and the key is rest. And one thing Dave mentioned is you can't give a magic number on how much days of pasture rest you should have. So I've got 2 farms. One I've had for 13, 14 years. I've been bale grazing on, I think, for 12. That farm literally, most summers, even the middle of summer, if I wanted to, I could go through that in 20 to 25 days. And I'd have plenty of height. That's because my organic matter is almost 6% there. The other farm that I'm going to show you pictures of has much lower organic matter. The biology is still at a fairly low state. The first year, and I'll show you pictures of that, the first year I had to wait 45 days to 50 days, even in mid-spring, to get the grass to where it needed to be. So it varies tremendously by the soil health that you have on that farm. Let's see here. So the other key, at least initially, to starting to build organic matter is to get those legumes cycling on your farm. And I say initially because once you build the organic matter up, we still want legumes for other reasons because they improve forage quality. But once you get that organic matter up, and I don't know, if it's 4.5, 5%, but somewhere in that range, you will have enough mineralization in terms of nitrogen from that natural cycling that you don't need the legumes from the standpoint of sucking in the nitrogen from the atmosphere into your system. It's still going to help, but it's not going to be nearly as necessary once the soil health is up compared to initially. So initially it's extremely important because that's how you're going to get most of that nitrogen into that system to what I call kind of priming the pump. And we'll talk about that later. What I'm going to show you now is not probably the best. This is the best research in terms of biological activity that's out there. It's being done, and he's been working on this for about 6-7 years. Alan Franz-Lubers, he's a soil scientist in North Carolina with the USDA. He's got a dual appointment with North Carolina State. And he actually is leading the soil side of that 6-state bale grazing grant. I've been working with him for a number of years and other things. So this is data that he sent to me. It's not complete, but it's enough where I can show you what's going on related to this. So I'm going to show you a couple of concepts. So on the left, that's soil biological activity. He's measuring it in the lab, so it's an approximation of what is going on in the field, if that makes sense. But you'll have to trust me, he does a good job at trying to measure that. And the numbers, think of that, it actually does mean something, but think of that just as a index. In other words, the higher it is, the better biological activity that's going on. On the bottom right-hand side, that is the amount of nitrogen that's being mineralized. Now, this he's still trying to calibrate because it's in the lab. So in other words, he's trying to figure out what in 27 days in the lab, what does that approximate in terms of total time during the growing season, if that makes sense, because you do it in the lab. He's still working on that, but the best he can tell me is it's less than 1 full growing season, but it's probably not like. So multiply whatever number we have down there probably by 1.5. That probably will give you approximation of the total mineralization you'd have in a growing season. But he's still working on it, so don't quote me on that. It's just an approximation. All right, so let me show you how this works. So let's say that we have a pasture, or it can be a crop ground, doesn't matter. This happened to be all pasture ground that he was sampling here that had a soil biological activity index of 200. So you draw a line over roughly, and by the way, before we bring that back, does that look like a pretty good correlation between soil biological activity and nitrogen mineralization? It's pretty darn close. I think the correlation was like 0.85 or 0.9. It's very, very high. So if we have a farm, and by the way, that's a low biological activity, around 200. So we just draw a line over to it, then wherever it roughly hits kind of the center of those dots, we draw that down, And that shows us roughly how much nitrogen is being mineralized. So if we read that, it's what, about 65 or 70, let's call it 70. And again, that would be not quite the full growing season, so maybe we instead of 70, it might be 100 or something like that. But let's just look at the absolute number because I want to show you differences here. So let's say we have another pasture that is doing much better. It has around a score of around 400. Same thing, we draw it over to kind of the center of those dots, draw that down. And how much nitrogen are we mineralizing in that scenario? About 165 or 70. Let's call it 170. So if the other 70 in that situation, it's 170, the difference between those two is what? 100 pounds or 100 units of nitrogen. Quite a bit of nitrogen, isn't it? And again, slow released over a growing season, not all at one time. So you all see how that works, right? The healthier our soils, the more nitrogen is going to be mineralized. And in most organic systems, what is the number one limiting nutrient in organic systems? Nitrogen, right? All right, here's where it gets more interesting. So, and Alan no one can show this to Alan because he would get mad at me, because what I'm going to do is show you the relationship between the biological activity and organic matter. Now, he doesn't like to do this because there's a little bit of variability, and also he wants you to do the soil test at his lab. But I'm going to show you a shortcut that can at least give you an approximation of what your soils might be mineralizing. So I've changed this slightly. So we still have soil biological activity on the left, but on the bottom now, we have what? Soil organic matter. Now again, look at that diagram. Does that look like a pretty good correlation between the two? All right. So I'm going to show you essentially what percent organic matter you would need to hit that 200 and 400 index that we just looked at. Does that make sense? All right. So to hit that 200, if we have about 2.5% organic matter on average, there's variability there, yes, we'll talk about that. But on average, that would give us that 200 biological index. Does that make sense? And to get the 400 biological index, if we have about 4.5% organic matter, we would be right about at that 400 level. Now, this is why Alan doesn't like me. If he did see I put the slide up, he'd get mad at me for this reason, probably. So there is a fair amount of variability there. So in other words, and I'm giving you about 3.8% organic matter. We'll come back to that later on, but there's a reason I'm doing that. So in other words, even if your organic matter is 3.8%, you could have how low roughly? What's the lowest biological activity you see in that range? About 200, right? What we just looked at. But what's the highest you'd see in that range? A little over 400, which is the other one we looked at, right? So why would we have that much variability in the same organic matter soil? And here I want you to think about it, because if you understand this, you're going to connect a whole bunch of dots. I would argue we should see that much variability, or maybe actually we should see more variability in this. Let me say one thing before you answer that. Alan works with what I would say a lot of progressive farms. In other words, he's not randomly going out and picking out the average farm in North Carolina or Kentucky. He's working with some of the better ones. They're probably doing a lot of things that we're looking at tonight.
Is it all at the same time of year?
It's all at the same time of year. There's nothing climatic related to that.
Relation to grazing event before or after?
No, could your, yes. Say it a little louder. It's not the soil. Let me assure you, I'm doing soil tests for Alan out here, and he is exact on how we take these things, to the point where I get mad at him. It's not that. A little bit maybe. Let me throw out a hypothetical situation. Within a soil that has 3.8% organic matter, you could have a wide range of people managing those various soils, right? If you have some that's doing everything right, in other words, they're doing good rotational grazing practices, or they're getting legumes incorporated, doing some bale grazing, would we expect that biology to be doing better than the same 3.8% organic matter that's continually grazed and overstocked? So a lot of that is due strictly to management, which you have complete control over, right? Now, he was working with some of the better farms, I'm guessing, so if we included the average farms in Kentucky, how would we expect that to change? I don't remember if I put it on here or not. I didn't. I'll show you this later on. My hypothesis, this would come way down. The top would stay about where it's at, but the bottom would come down. We'd have actually more variability. So in other words, if you have really good management within a range there, you might be towards the top of that. If you're kind of average, you might be in the middle, and if you're poor, you'd be at the bottom or lower. So we can use organic matter as a proxy for your biological activity, but you're going to have to probably factor in your management into it. Does that make sense? All right, let me show you the power of soil mineralization here with a couple more slides. This is quite a few years ago. I did this 1 year, and it worked well, but just management-wise, it was a pain in the butt, and so I just did it 1 year. So this is on my first farm. This is actually on rental ground right here. What I did is I no-tilled. It's a grazing corn, so I'm grass finished, but that's a male sterile corn, so it didn't develop a cob on it. And I did it 1 year, and by the way, the cattle loved it. But this was on a rental ground that actually had decent soil. Actually, that same one I think I talked about before. Decent soil, but it had just not been managed well for decades. So, and I didn't have the biology test at that time. It was before I knew Alan, but my guess is the soil biology level actually had decent organic matter. Not great, but decent organic matter. Good soil, but probably poor or lower biological activity in that soil. That was taken 60 days after I planted that grazing corn. And it was, you can see, some of it is waist high, and the cattle just went in here, but towards the bottom, that stuff was like knee high. Cattle loved it, but it did not have much growth. The next picture I'm going to show you was 5 days later, so it had a little bit more time to grow, but 5 days. Same planting date, same management in terms of how I got it established, same everything. But it was on the soil on my main farm that at that time had organic matter between 5.5 and 5.75%. I'm going to show you the difference now. That's what that looked like. No nitrogen was added to either of them. In other words, everything that grew there came out of the soil, came from the microbes, et cetera. Do you see a little bit difference between those two? What do you think that's due to? The increased biological activity here, mineralizing that nitrogen. All right, what I'm going to do now is, this is for a grazing system. I'm going to show you, this is the second farm that I have, and what I'm going to do is show you the transformation of that farm over the first 2 years that I owned it. Because it was so worn down, I want to show you. So caveats, no commercial fertilizer put on here, no herbicides put on this over the 2 years. What you're seeing is just good grazing management, bale grazing, which you're seeing here. I'll explain what went on. Clipping weeds, getting legumes incorporated, all the things that we've talked about tonight. So this picture was taken end of February 2020. It was a leap year, that's why there's 29 days. I had gone through about half the farm bale grazing at this point. But what you see is an actual accumulation. So we put cattle on it in late fall. So what you're seeing actually is accumulation of growth since about mid-June. So this had been cut for hay for about 2 decades. Had a lot of nitrogen put down in the spring, and it always got a really good first cutting, but after that it just died out, and you can see why. In other words, they did nothing after that. I was supposed to take it over or later in the summer and hold, I won't go into details on that. It was during COVID, and it just didn't work out. But basically, that sat there for over half the growing season. You can see the accumulation of growth. It was a worn-down farm. Nothing. If it did not get its urea, it did not know how to grow. This was May 3rd, so the first grazing season. So I bale grazed over the entire farm that first winter. This was the first grazing season, May 3rd. Early May, should the grass be growing at peak growth by that time? It should be. By probably 20th or 25th of April, it should be. Cattle had not been in there yet. You can see pretty much the whole grazing stick, right? That was about as poor growth as I could have. I knew I would not have real good growth that first spring, but I was not prepared at how poor it actually would be. Again, typically it would have got its urea in early April, and it would be doing fine. May 6th, the reason I'm showing this picture is we were still bale grazing. That was the last bale that was set out, but we were still feeding hay on May 6th. The production was that poor. And I hope you all can appreciate it now. By the way, look at, in all these next set of pictures, look at all the weeds on this farm. And by the way, every picture that you see from this point on will be when the cattle go into a new paddock, not when they've been there for 3 or 4 days. So every one of these will be a fresh paddock. So early June, again, you can see all the weeds, right? Early July, this is even more pronounced. That was really good pollinator habitat. If I could have got NRCS to pay me 50 or 75 bucks an acre for that, I probably would have kept doing it. But not so good forage for cattle, I think we can all agree. Here's mid-July. And by the way, the last series of pictures, pretty much as soon as the cattle went off the pasture, I was out there doing what? Clipping weeds, trying to turn that into soil biology, or food for the soil biology. And I think this was, I'm not certain, but I think this was about the last paddock that after they went off this, that was clipped, and then that cycle was done. The only thing that was growing well that first year was the annual Lespedeza. That legume that I told you works really well is that Burge legume. That's the only thing that grew well, other than the weeds. Bale grazed one more winter, so this was January, that second winter. You can see where I bale grazed the first winter, right? You can see almost where the broom sedge was just about perfectly eliminated. Not completely, but pretty close. Now, a point I want to make is I fed about the same number of bales both winter times. So in other words, about the same amount of chemical fertility was put down the first winter as the second winter. So keep that in mind. So here's the next year, next spring, May 9th. Now you remember the picture from May 6th, and this is that's the closest I have between the two, May 6th and May 9th. That's why I'm going to show you this picture. So remember how poor it was on May 6th? All right, this is what it looked like that next year, roughly the same time. Is it a little bit of a difference between the two? Now again, roughly the same amount of raw N, P, and K chemical fertility was put down both winters, but why was there a dramatic change the second year? Any guesses? I don't know for sure. My guess is it's all related to soil biology. Can the soil biology change in a couple months? It takes time, right? And it takes time doing everything right. I don't know this for sure, but that is my guess. Here's midsummer. So the red clover was actually seeded the first winter, didn't do much the first grazing season. I had about maybe a third of the farm that had decent red clover, but the bulk of it was still the annual Lespedeza, and that's late fall. Now, we had really good fall rains, but I'm willing to bet I grew more grass on that farm in October than I grew the entire previous year. And I don't think it was an exaggeration. So again, what are the differences? I think that first spring, the soil biology just wasn't doing anything. It didn't know how to. It was probably decimated. It took a year or so for it to come back to life. And that second year still wasn't perfect. By the way, that was still 2 weeks behind my other farm that I'd bale grazed for over 10 years at that time. But it was a whole lot better. And again, not 1 pound of commercial fertilizer, no herbicides. By the way, did you see many weeds in that second year? It was amazing. I mean, there were weeds, but it was a 95% reduction, all based on, I think, soil biology. And again, I pointed this out before. So the organic matter on that farm was not bad. It was about 3.8%. Now again, this is the better managed farms, probably in Allen's. Where was I that first year? I think I was way down there. I don't know that. Again, it was before I knew about that test, but my guess is that's probably where that farm was. What am I trying to share? Let me just quickly go through. So we talk about what are the biggest changes, and it's not just the bale grazing. Bale grazing was one component of it, but again, just good grazing management will start that process of changing the soil biology. Legumes initially, you need to get that nitrogen in that cycle to get things cycling. The clipping of pastures, the bale grazing there's no doubt that's a big part of it, but it's somehow you've got to have a system to really get that biology going, what I call priming the pump. And once you get that prime pumped for that soil biology, then you start building organic matter. And in the long run, I hope we can all appreciate it. I think in the long run, the best fertility you can have in any organic system is that organic matter. Once you get that up 5% or so, essentially you've got a bulletproof pasture. You really have to work to screw that thing up. And it's doing that for free, year after year after year. You just have to take care of it a little bit with good management. All right, I hope we still have a few minutes for questions.
We're to the end of the session time, but we've got the room until they start opening it up for lunch.
Okay.
If we have a few questions, we can go until
Yeah, we're going to stick around.
Okay, so there could be questions after. Does anybody have any questions? Real quick, while we're still up there.
The second year that you clipped, you mentioned the first year that you clipped. The second year, did you have to clip the weeds as much as the previous year?
I did the same amount of clipping, but there were just a lot fewer weeds, but there's still enough weeds that the reason I clipped the first time anyways is not so much for weeds. Even at the other farm I do that, it's basically to reset the grass so that it's vegetative.
Did that help the second year?
It definitely helped the second year also, yeah. Yes.
Seed rates you did on that farm from 2020 on? Any seeding that you did on the farm that you were showing us at the end from 2020 on?
In the permanent pastures, every acre got annual Lespedeza between 6 and 8 pounds the acre. It got a little bit of red clover, a little bit of orchard grass, and those were the keys. I think I mixed in some plantain and chicory, but again, in permanent pasture, it's hard to get that. But the main things were the annual Lespedeza, the red clover, which you didn't even see that first year. The second year that came on.
Okay, thank you.
So you were at 2.5% organic there. So how many years, what were you up to?
14, I started off, baseline was 2.5, and 22, 5%. Yeah. So, you know, if you can do 0.25% per year, you're doing pretty decent. I do not. That is a good point. I've done some field days and people have said, well, but you got to drag that. They're gone. 45 days, the manure's gone. I do not drag the pastures.
Now, if the biology in your pastures is not there, those patties will sit there. And I've been amazed by the farms I've been on in Kentucky where it's absolutely correct. In other words, those patties are still there in June from the previous winter. And on the first farm that I've got really good biology, I mean, I literally challenge people. I'll give you $50 a pad, manure pad, if there's anything there by late May.
Along that line, there are soil type and terrain differences that make it different for everybody on bale grazing, but I still think it's a great thing. Jenny?
Greetings, everyone. Sorry to interrupt a conversation in progress. Just want to let you know that if you would like to have a stretch break after a morning of sitting, Monet Proctor is getting ready to start a functional movement for farmers stretch break on the right-hand wall when you walk in meeting room A. Hope to see you there. Thanks for being here.
Greg and Dave and Mike are going to